we need wisdom for what's next in North American cities. And so what's going to happen now is we're going to listen to some leaders from diverse backgrounds who are experts in some aspect of urban life, and they're going to be talking about what is the state of North American cities. So I'm going to ask them to come up, the panel, at this time, and Ed Stetzer is going to be moderating that. Ed knows one or two things about missiology and cities as well. And Ed will introduce all of the panel. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you. We're going to actually share this microphone over here, so why don't you take this, Paco? That'd be good. Okay, so I'm actually going to have you quickly introduce yourselves. Mention your name and your church or your organization that you serve and what city it is in. We'll start over with you, Bishop. Go ahead.
Y'all all know me already.
Well, do it anyway. Help me out.
I'm Horace Smith from Chicago, Illinois, the Apostolic Faith Church.
Thank you, my friend. Noah?
Noah Tolley with Wheaton College Center for Urban Engagement. We've got things going on campus out at Wheaton, but also here in the city.
Very good.
Milton Friesen from Hamilton, Ontario. I'm with Cardis and direct a program called Social Cities that looks at the social infrastructure of our communities.
Duke Kwan, I'm the lead pastor of Grace Meridian Hill, a congregation that's part of the Grace DC network in Washington, D.C.
Mark, I'm interested to see how you introduce yourself. Because we're all wondering, are you the pastor of New Life Church?
Yeah, Mark, Joe. You know, I was just thinking about this, Ed. I was thinking, you know, we've planted 27 locations, but you're like an assistant teacher at about 27 churches. Every church I talk to is like, yeah, Ed, he is assistant pastor at this church. So I can't keep up with how many churches you're assistant pastor at.
I'm a motivational speaker living in a van down by the river.
I'm Mark Joe, pastor of New Life Community Church, soon to be president of Moody Bible Institute.
There you go, here you go. I'm sorry for the rest of you. We're a little excited in Chicago. Like everybody in Chicago is excited, except you. Yeah, you have to explain why you're not as excited.
Well, I was just walking down the street. Somebody pulled me over and said, hey, can you stop? I was like, I'm just kidding. But I'm actually a pastor in New Life Community Church in the Mexican neighborhood. I mentored Pastor Mark, and I'm just kidding. But anyways, so he's my boss, I guess, doubly.
Horace, let me go back to you, and let's start our conversation. We're going to look at where we are now, and people hear all in the news about Chicago, and maybe they don't know what to believe or what not to believe. So, I mean, what's going on? What's the state of the city in Chicago?
I was born, who was I talking to? I was born in Cook County Hospital in Chicago. I was raised here. I lived in the projects. I know this city from many different aspects of the city. I have seen over the decades not much change in the city. I think that Charlie set it up appropriately. I suggest to you that most of us believe what we read, which is a big mistake. We need to do genuine research and find out the truth, because the truth is not what you read in the newspapers or go on the social internet and those things. Chicago is a vibrant city. I have friends around the world who ask me, aren't you afraid to live in Chicago? But I've been in 100 cities. It's no different from the cities on one hand, but Chicago historically has been divided. It is divided socioeconomically, it's divided racially, it's divided in so many ways. And unfortunately, and to some degree, the church, our church, including all of our churches, have not been set up to break down barriers. We've been more set up to be comfortable where we are and what we do. And I think that what God is saying now is that we're going to have to come out of our comfort zones, begin to talk to one another in a different way, and be willing to risk what before we weren't. So I don't know, it's a city that is multiple cities, and we all know this. You can go to a Polish neighborhood, you can go to a Russian neighborhood, you can go to a Mexican neighborhood, you can go to a Cuban neighborhood, you can go to a black neighborhood. I mean, we're so divided so that we see each other differently. We don't see each other as equals or human beings. We say we do, but we don't. We have a different perspective based on our upbringing. So what you've been taught, you tend to believe that. Unfortunately, most of the time it's wrong. So I think that we're divided because we don't know one another. And, it's time for us to have the courage and the spiritual fortitude to begin to talk the truth. I'll use this time. I applaud Charlie for saying what he said. It was a risk for him to do that. But until we speak truth, and until we speak it not at our enemies, but at our friends, until we speak truth and say, wait a minute, what you're saying is not what I live every day. Come live with me for a moment. You may find out that what you read about, is not true. I have a lot to say about it, but to stop because I'm a pastor. But, again, I'm a scientist too. Ask yourself if the statistics are right about different parts of our city, African American, whatever. As a scientist, we have to ask the question, why is that? We don't just say, is there crime in the inner city? Yes, there is. Now let's ask the real question. Why is there crime? Are these people different human beings than the ones that live in your neighborhood? No, they are not. If I can put your kids in the environment they live in, they'll act just like they act. If we're honest about it, we don't want to take responsibility for what the truth really is, so we disparage one another. But we're all made in God's image. We're made the same, but we have different environments. And so I think the church's job is to identify, again, what the needs are and come alongside and make a difference. I'll talk more later.
No, it's a good word. It's a good word.
Yeah.
Paco, let me come to you because you've introduced yourself. You said Mexican community. We know each other, so I know some of your journey. What is it the same? Is it different? What's it like in your community? What's your Chicago like?
Well, the neighborhood where I live, the parish down the block, the priest told me that the congregation that he leads is the largest one in the Archdiocese of Chicago. I don't know if it's true or not, but they have like 16 services every Sunday, masses, I guess, and they go 1 hour, and on the other side they have no parking. So I guess that's a myth. You can have 10,000 people and no parking. It's a sense of people walking to church. What I see is a vibrant community. Of course, it's vibrant in both ways. There's negative vibrancy and there's positive vibrancy. One thought, I've gotten to the great privilege of being able to speak throughout mostly the Midwest in Spanish-speaking churches. And it's interesting that I was just in a church in Iowa, and somebody introduced me as coming from Little Village, and people knew our neighborhood. And so there's this sense that the city really has undertows of a lot of things that are going on, and we'll never forget Ray Backey telling us, if you follow the flow of immigration in and out the city, you will never have enough for your mission. In other words, you will continue to have work, and feels like I see that, the vibrancy of connection, not just in our neighborhood, but throughout, from there to the rest of the world.
Now, Little Village, of course, has gone through some changes as well. Give us a little bit of history.
I would say the Mexican neighborhood, immigration from Mexico has tapered off. Of course, since the bubble, the bubble was popped, and the guy that lives in our neighborhood is the drywallero, so he's the one that does the drywall throughout the city of Chicago. And so they were the first ones that lost jobs, back in 2008 or so. And so Mexican immigration has pretty much tapered off. Still, there's a lot of immigration from Central America. Some of you guys have been hearing of the movement of people coming from Central America, just pretty much marching their way up north. And so that has been a very big, significant change. On the other side, I feel like the church together, there's a little microcosm of how the church working together with even secular organizations in our neighborhood, we've seen a drastic change in crime in our city, in our neighborhood. I mean, really, literally, I don't see gangbangers in our corners anymore. And I think it has mainly been, many other things that have happened also socioeconomically, and people moving out of the city to the neighborhoods, but to other cities. But we have seen the church working together in our neighborhood to really change, like lower gang crime. I mean, there's many other things that have happened.
Now, I want to start with Chicago because we are here. This is our city. But Noah, I want to also expand from there. You're a scholar. You teach urban studies and more. Is Chicago the norm, or is it different than other U.S. cities? We'll go broader from there in just a minute. But talk to us about how it relates to other cities.
Sure. Thanks, Ed. Chicago for a long time was considered the paradigmatic U.S. city, actually. There's a whole school of urban studies called the Chicago School of Urban Studies, which depended on thinking that Chicago was the place you would go to learn about cities, and by learning about Chicago, you would learn about every city. Now, to some extent, that approach is no longer in vogue, but on the other hand, many of the things that are true about Chicago are still true about other U.S. cities. There's a recent book by Robert Sampson, a sociologist at Harvard, called Great American City. And it's called Great American City because Chicago still does stand in some ways for other cities. And here's one of them. We just heard two answers about Chicago. One of the things that they have in common is they highlighted what historian and sociologist Janet Abu-Lugo described as Chicago's elegant facade and its deeply shadowed backstage. And when I teach a class on Chicago, I want all my students to take that away. In fact, I want all of you to take that away. Chicago's elegant facade and deeply shadowed backstage. And when Abu-Lugo used that metaphor, she drew it from theater. And she didn't just mean it has fancy parts and not so fancy parts. Your Lincoln Parks, your Loops, your Hyde Parks, your Wrigleyvilles, and then other parts of the city. That's not what she meant. She meant that just like in the theater, the things that go on in the deeply shadowed backstage make the show go on. The show doesn't go on without those neighborhoods. She also meant that in the theater, this separation creates some inequity, some inequality. You get the people who get the attention and then the people who don't. It's also intentional. You have an intentional separation between the facade and the backstage, and in Chicago it's intentional. But it's more than that. What color are the people on the tech crew wearing? This is the one question I'll ask. It's Ed's turn to ask questions, but I'll ask you. What color do people on the tech crew wear? Black. The people in the elegant facade, in the theater, people wear black in the backstage and they wear colorful things in the front stage. They wear costumes, right? In the theater, you wear black in the backstage so that you're not seen. And in Chicago, the people in the deeply shadowed backstage for a long time have been typically non-white, right? Especially in Chicago, the tension has been black and white historically, but non-white, we'll say. And I think that's something we need to reckon with, and it's something we're hearing already on the panel.
Duke, you were, if I understand correctly, came out of Redeemer Ministry and some mentoring and connection there, went to D.C., as we kind of broaden out from Chicago and start looking, of course, there's all kinds of cities we go to. We're going to go to Canada in just a minute. But tell us what's different, what's the same, what do you see in your city?
Yeah. Washington, D.C. it's a unique place, as you all might imagine, being the nation's capital. And so, of course, that's pretty defining for people's experience of the city, whether if it's hearings on the Hill or executive orders being issued in the White House, or marches happening on the National Mall. These are all things that are happening almost literally in our backyard. In our case, 3 miles down from where we live. Everywhere you go, even those that aren't engaged professionally in politics, it's in the air, it's in the conversation. The big joke in town is it's the only place where every 4 years, every bar in town will be playing presidential debates and instead of football, because after all, politics is sport. And there's an interest, and a defining interest in our city, but at ground level, it's the same. At ground level, we are a city of historic neighborhoods with residents who are struggling with all the same things that you all are struggling with. Miscarriages, loneliness, lost jobs, lost parents, all the struggles and travails of life. I think one of the things that DC is embattling, that many of our cities, most of our cities are in one way or another, is the power of gentrification. This is quite defining to even beyond just the change in housing prices, which impacts everybody, and that's a significant thing. Church planting, for example, is becoming increasingly more expensive, a more difficult endeavor in our major global cities. But also have in mind the culture change within this city. Washington, D.C. historically has been known as Chocolate City because of the historic presence of African American peoples and culture. Some have begun to quip that it's now turned into Cappuccino City. Who is the city of Washington now most hospitable to? Its institutions, its communities, its festivals, its relationships. Who is most welcome? That has shifted. I think in its racial dynamics, gentrification has pulled in a lot of different kinds of people into places that really in past generations have been racially homogenous, but that doesn't mean we are an integrated city. We are separated by invisible lines of micro-segregations. People's lives are not bumping into each other. Economically as well, the rich and the poor live side by side in almost unprecedented fashion, and yet we're in danger of making the poor more invisible than ever, overlooked as cities become defined by its wealth, its sexiness, and its attractiveness to the watching world. These are all effects of gentrification that are concerning and have big impact to our lives in DC, but I think to a lot of our cities across the country.
Good word, Duke. I so appreciate your voice. I have a little list on Twitter that I follow of about 30 people, and you're on that 30 people. You're deeply thoughtful, and I so appreciate what you say. Milton, I want to go to you because I want to go. You're there at Cardis. You direct Social Cities. Cardis is in Hamilton, and I'm not just biased because my wife was born there and grew up in Canada. But Canada has some differences. I don't know what the similarities are. We know that Toronto and Vancouver have more foreign-born people who live there than people who are born in Canada. So the distinction is obvious in some ways, but similar in other ways. So take us to a broader view. This is the North American Conference. What's different with Canada? What's similar with cities?
Maybe I'll start with the similarities, and it is that wherever you are, city, small city, town, village, or even semi-rural area, you have a certain locality where you spend most of your time and where most of your life happens. And so when you look at life at sort of that granular level, I think you would find a tremendous amount of similarity, Canadian cities east to west, or Canadian and US cities north to south. My wife and I, we've organized family road trips for a long time now, usually every second year, where we spend a month on the road. Classic family road trip, whether the kids like it or not, they come along. And we've gone through all the US states and many of the cities, small and large and in between, the Canadian provinces. And every time we come back from one of those trips, including our last trip this summer where we took 3 weeks and drove south until we were close enough to wave to Cuba at Key West, and then we turned around and drove back home. But everywhere you go across those spaces, what you're left with is a striking sense of commonality. I mean, the landscape's different, people have different sort of sense of things, they speak differently, there's different foods available, but you have a strong sense of affinity with each other when you meet directly. So I think the commonalities are significant. And you were talking about ignoring newspapers and ignoring, to some extent, yes, ignore those kinds of broad brushstrokes that I think they blind us to kind of very significant, immediate granularities. And if anybody can be tuned into that, it's church planters. You don't plant a national church in a sense. I mean, you plant churches in a neighborhood, in a community with actual human beings, not sort of, an average person. You don't plant churches in sort of general neighborhoods. They're actually specifically somewhere. That's the commonality. I think the differences are that Canada's divisions are also, there are racial, of course, and cultural divisions. Our significant one is French and English. That's one. There's a very significant divides at some points between French-speaking Canadians in Quebec and those who don't. But there's also significant divides east and west. I grew up in Alberta. For those of you who don't know about Alberta, Alberta's a little bit like Texas. We have parties in the past that have, vied for separation. When I was growing up, Petro-Canada...
So, like Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah, Texas likes to leave too, so we're the...
Petro-Canada was a national, oil and gas firm that sold. When I was growing up in Alberta, I was taught that Petro-Canada stood for Pierre Elliott Trudeau rips off Canada. And as a kid, I actually thought that's what it means, and later learned, of course, that's not what it stands for. So I think those differences... they start to show up to some extent in a sort of artificial way. But again, I go back to say the bigger substance and the stuff we're interested in, I'm working on, is the particular sense in which those localities have tremendous common overlaps. Canada, US, East, West, small city, big city.
And this is the work that you're doing with Cardis, and people can find more information there as well,
Yes.
which is very helpful. Mark, I've left you out intentionally because I've gone from Chicago to the US to Canada, North America, but I want you to represent the totality of the entire universe.
Got it.
You're a pastor of a megachurch and the president of a school. Good
By
luck
the way,
with
you're
that.
still not following me on Twitter, I don't think.
That is true. Well, actually, I've blocked you on Twitter. But anyway, so that being said, so I mean, what's the kingdom reality? Why do we, and again, maybe in some ways it's self-evident in a room like this, but not everyone would grasp that. How does the work of the kingdom intersect with the kingdoms of this world represented in cities?
Yeah. Ed, I want to say, first of all, that, you know, I look at this panel, and we have at two opposite ends of the panel, two extraordinary, from my perspective, representations of what it means to be embedded pastors into the city. This guy's a medical doctor. I mean, he's a doctor at Laurie's Hospital, which is a huge hospital, but yet he pastors a church, and you may not know this. I've preached at his church before. And he invited me. We talk about bridging the gap. He invited me. He's invited me a couple of times. Bridging the Gap, African American church. But he's not only pastoring for many, many years, but he's building community centers, programs to the neighborhood. People, when they look at this, they look at a church that's actually changing the community because it's outside of the walls. I look at Paco Amador. The same thing, but in a whole different context. And by the way, Chicago is basically a third, white, Hispanic, black, some Asian, but minority. And Paco's doing the same thing, but in a little village. A pastor that's embedded in the community, been there a long time. They've figured out how to get outside of the walls of the church, doing tons of, it's the church, but it's the church outside of the walls. And when I look at Chicago, and I'm not an expert on all the cities around the world, but I feel like I know Chicago because we've planted in 27 locations around Chicago. And so we've had to analyze a bunch of different neighborhoods. But when I look at Chicago, I'm super encouraged about what God is doing. I'm super pumped up about the gospel. I'm encouraged about church planters, and this is a gathering of church planters and people that have a vision for that. And can I say, man, it's really, really good to see a bunch of church planters. It's good to see a bunch of white, educated church planters, but hopefully we're not just targeting the neighborhoods that are gentrified in the city. Hopefully we're also targeting a bunch of the minority communities in the city, because I feel like sometimes we're like overpopulating the gentrified neighborhoods. Every church plant I run into is planting in one of those areas, and I'm really glad that this is a diverse area here. Because I think that's the way we're going to win our cities.
Okay, so when we look historically, I want to go through a few issues. I want to talk about migration. I want to talk about, well, we'll go through several. So one of the things I mentioned earlier in the welcome was that this was once a poor area, and it's no longer a poor area. But the poor that were here, right on the outside of the church, it says a sign that says, "Ever welcome in this house are the strangers and the stranger and the poor." And that was very much how this church began. But it was poor Swedes and poor Norwegians and things of that sort, a very different experience. The Great Migration, when literally millions of African Americans moved from the south into northern cities, particularly Mississippi to Chicago. There are actually streets on the south side of Chicago that are named after towns in Mississippi where people moved up in mass. So let's talk a little bit about how that impacts things when it's happening, but also a little bit later on. Horace, I want to start with you. And then what I want to ask is just actually for you, whoever would like to speak into it, how is immigration, maybe long-term migration, how are these things impacting you in your city or impacting cities in general as scholars and leaders? Let's start with you.
Yeah, you mentioned immigration, and again, forgive me for my focus. You know, African Americans are the only group that were enslaved for 400 years. We tend to start with, you know, Italians came from Italy in the 20s. Poles came from behind the Iron Curtain. But I will guarantee you their historical experience was nothing like It is, even for me, unimaginable to have 400 years of abject slavery. You had no personal identification. You had no rights. You had no opportunity. Now, we say that's the distant past, but we as people of God know this. If you don't deal with what has happened, you can't fast forward and say, let's start now.
That's right.
So the difference is that the Great Migration, as you heard Charlie talk about it, people had been liberated in a sense, but not really. The Jim Crow South, you ought to read about it. It was horrendous.
Yeah.
It was horrendous. So they migrated to the north with a hope of having a chance to be somebody. When they got here, they had better jobs, but there's certain areas they couldn't live in. When I was 12 years old, my grandmother took me downtown. She told me what stores I could go into and which ones I couldn't. This is not past history.
That's
I
right.
remember, I carry that. What drives me, how do you do what you do? I'm driven.
Yeah.
I've been given great opportunity. I owe it to my ancestors. I owe it to people that didn't have my opportunity to go to University of Illinois and go to Northwestern. I owe it to them because I understand. I could not go in Weibo's department store. I go to the Fields Fair store. And so even though the law said one thing, it was not the reality that people lived every single day. And so it's not harping on the past.
That's right. Okay, but help me with this, because I agree with you. And this crowd is diverse, but not a majority African American crowd. So what should non-African Americans know about that, and particularly we're talking about cities, about that experience that impacts how we engage and relate and learn?
What Charlie said was, when you have to experience a little bit. You have to put yourself back in those shoes as people of God and say, how was that? I always say I preach two sermons. One to African Americans. I tell my young men, be chaste, go to school, show up. But I tell other people, get your foot off their neck. They're two simultaneous sermons. Because if you have power, you have no idea what it means, what it feels like not to have power. So you start out defensive. The church has to own up to its position of authority and not become divided on lines that are not human. So what I'd say to you is that, what should they do? They should begin to empathize in a way that walks alongside long enough. I'm a physician. I use a crude analogy about this whole thing. I say it's like we decide we're going to run a race, and I break your leg first. I put it in a cast, and then in 2 weeks I take it off and say, okay, let's run. Let's be fair. That's not fair.
Yeah, you wouldn't have
That's
needed
not
to do
fair.
that. You would have beat me anyway.
Right, well, you
so
wouldn't
let's
be,
just
yeah,
get
I'd beat
that
you
out
anyway.
there. Yeah.
But it takes.
But it's true, right? There's a different starting point.
It takes certain rehab to do that. My point is that you have to really walk with people without feeling like you're better, you're higher. When they came to me about this conference, I said to the conference organizers, and I applaud this conference. But I said, if you want African Americans here, don't set an agenda and invite them.
I like it.
Do not do that. It is an insult.
Yeah.
Invite them at the beginning, allow them input, and they'll come in droves. But if you set it, and then tell me, what we feel is that, here you go again, telling me what I need, and I don't need you to tell me that. So I'm not bitter. I'm saying, if the church is going to be able to leverage what it is, it's going to have to go back to what Christ said about walking with the people where they are.
That's good.
And if you do that, because if you have power, you have responsibility. You can't say, I didn't do it, because you're living in a generation that has benefited.
That's good.
I was blessed to have, he said, how did you make it? I had a father who told me what I was going to do, and I did it.
Yeah.
I didn't, Do you want to go to school? No. He told me, you'll go to school, you'll study, you'll learn, and it was drilled into me. So I escaped. A lot of these kids have never seen a father.
That's right.
But we put them in untenable situations and we want them to thrive. They can't. Walk with them.
So good.
Walk with them, and they will. So my point is that immigration, it's a little bit different when you come from
this side,
Russia,
sure.
'cause
Whole different feel.
and come to Chicago. But when you come from the South,
Yeah.
it's a different experience altogether.
Well,
And
let's-
so
so
we
let's
got to
stay
break
there.
down these walls
Yeah.
of separation and let people walk together.
So let's stay there a little bit on the topic of race and racial inequality and more. Noah, you were going to say something to add to that. Go ahead.
Because that was fantastic. I'm going to ask Milton to do me a favor so I don't forget things. Riot, responsibility, and build. And if I were a pastor, they'd all start with R, but they don't. So if I forget something, you got to tell me those 3 words, okay? First, I want to say that, in response to what you just said, in response to Pastor Dates a few minutes ago, one of the things that some of us need to learn alongside is that the gospel is about God delivering us not only from the errors of our ways, but also from the terrors of the world. That when God makes all things new, in his new creation, in what he meant for our order together and our communities together, he will be delivering us as well from the terrors of the world. And one of the things we need to listen to very carefully is when people draw our attention to that, because it is an extremely privileged position to be able to listen to and speak only about the errors of our ways, as if the terrors of our world only come in when we're dealing with, say, diseases that old, wealthy white people tend to pass away from. But we need to be there alongside to hear about what the gospel means on a day-to-day basis when it comes to the terrors of this world, and that God will one day deliver us from them. What were the words? Riot, right? 100 years ago next year, so 99 years ago, was Chicago's first big race riot, 1919. And that race riot was caused by the conditions after the Great Migration began, and in its second phase during World War I, when many blacks moved from the South and were forced to live in very close quarters in a very segregated environment, not allowed funding to buy their own homes and not allowed to rent in other neighborhoods. And they took jobs of white servicemen who left, and then there were black servicemen who left too. And after World War II, when people came back, there was a lot of tension having to do with segregation and having to do with those jobs. White servicemen said, why did I lose my job to somebody who moved up here from Mississippi? And black servicemen said, why can I kill and die for my country, but I can't have this job? Or I can't buy that house. And the racial tensions were really high. And I don't know if you know this, but at a beach one day on Lake Michigan, not far from here, there was a black youth swimming, and a white beachgoer threw a stone that knocked him out, caused him to drown and die. And when people confronted those throwing the stones, the police came to the aid of the white people who had thrown the stones and ignored the claim of the black community. To me, that sounds like a lesson we haven't learned in 100 years. The next point was responsibility. We talk a lot about responsibility, and you hit both angles of that. You hit the angle of teaching boys as they're growing up, and the angle of teaching people to get their feet off their necks, right? It is personal responsibility to get your feet off the necks. It is personal responsibility not to build a world in which we have massive segregation and injustice. Those of us who are separating justice and personal responsibility are doing an injustice to what personal responsibility is. We are personally responsible for those conditions, and we need to step up. And build was the last one, right? Build, sorry. Milton, I didn't need you, but I was afraid I would forget.
I totally think that was like a fake thing you just did to totally get your list.
Yeah, my faith in myself is
If
really
you
low,
could, if you could land the plane on the sermon, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
That would be great. Just go ahead and get there.
That's right. So that you can trust me to come preach now. I just need to replace build with something that starts with R.
Reconstruct.
Build. Reconstruct.
Dude, that's like you couldn't come up with an R?
I couldn't. I was too busy listening to Horace.
Like, this is first year Bible college, how to alliterate. Oh my gosh.
So,
all right.
R, yeah, that's right. I shouldn't be teaching college, that's true. I need to come up with an R first. Reconstruct was really good. So reconstruct, when we're constructing our cities, there's good reason to believe that we should be constructing them with people in mind that we don't typically see. And I mean people that are in communities that we don't see well, people that may be in future generations that we don't see well, and people that may be far off from us, to answer Ed's question about migration, that we don't see well, right? Who are the people we don't see well? The cities of refuge in the Old Testament were built with people in mind that they would never see. The whole point of those places, their infrastructure, their communities, their laws, was to serve people they didn't know, to serve strangers, to serve possibly even enemies, people who looked suspicious. That's what we need to do.
Milton, go ahead.
A couple of quick points, I think, along that front. One is that immigration continues to change our cities.
It does.
So if you come to Toronto and the GTA or the GTHA, the Greater Toronto Hamilton area.
Which only people in Hamilton refer to it that way.
That's right.
But go ahead. Just the GTA to the rest of them.
If you come and visit, you will find, various estimates of 170 different languages spoken in Toronto, the most diverse city in the world in terms of the number and extent of people who come from elsewhere. 50% of areas where people were not born in Canada have come from some other place. So diversity is here. I mean, it's part of cities, and it's not only part of large cities. You can find cities across Canada and the U.S. where even in small amounts, significant newcomers are showing up, and they are changing the landscape. One example in Canada is that those newcomers often are coming from places in the world where their religious practices were simply part of life. They did not accept and haven't grown up with and don't have inculturated the sort of secular and private sort of spiritual religious side. So they're bringing with them expectations that this is part of life, and they're speaking up and they're moving the dial in some cases towards more public engagement on religious questions. That can be a good thing. That's a very important set of questions about who is allowed to speak in the public square. So I think that's important. The second piece is that some of the issues that we face will not be dealt with if we don't attend to the structural inequalities.
That's good.
So individuals can have great intentions. We can mount movements to try to change things. But if we do not understand the often social, sort of infrastructural nature of the problems, we can invest and work and sweat, and sometimes the problem gets worse. So a guy that's probably not often quoted in places like this, but a guy named Ivan Illich, who was a Catholic priest, who said, "I love the church capital C, but I'm a sharp critic of the church lowercase c, the hierarchical structural part of it that's not working so well." And he had this term called iatrogenics, that you have a hospital that makes people sick. It's intended to do one thing, it does the opposite. You have an educational institution that impairs learning. You have a spiritual community care for the weak and the poor and the neglected that actually abuses and takes advantage of them. That's iatrogenics. Those structural inequalities are really pernicious. We see this in city planning. You talk to city planners, they all know higher density, let's have diverse use of space, and yet we continue to build cities that look a lot like the ones that created the problems in the first place. So that sense of learning the literacies of these infrastructural dynamics, to me, is critical. I know we're not talking about the future now, but it's right here. So it's not about the future, it's actually present. And if we don't figure that out, I think we're going to have a tough time. We're just going to be frustrated trying to solve the same problems the same way and getting the same poor results.
Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, has been a very significant look at the scissoring of society, is what he calls it, worth our read and attention. I wonder with Duke and with Paco, when we talk about race in the U.S., and of course a little different, visible minorities, different language used in Canada and more, we talk about race in the U.S., sometimes it becomes a binary conversation. It's an African-American and Anglo conversation. In cities and context, you're in a predominantly African-American city, you're in a more diverse context here as well. Either one of you, or maybe both of you, how do you step into that as a kingdom representative and gospel witness in the midst of some of the racial tension that may be there and the racial inequality?
You want me to go first? All right. One of the thoughts that is super interesting and shocking for me is how much Americans and even the Western world, it's like a movement that keeps on, there's a growth of nationalist movements throughout the world, and how Christians tend to be the ones that espouse it the most. It's like kind of build the borders, like get rid of people, and it feels so counter gospel. Because it's Acts 8, it's like we have it by DNA. There arose a great persecution, and all believers, as they were scattered, the Bible says they preached the gospel wherever they went. It's like, it's like almost it's our inheritance, to be a people that move throughout the world. And I feel like immigration does something to the soul that most of the time takes a long time for people that don't migrate. Every single one of us are going to ask ourselves very deep, profound questions, kind of like life-altering questions throughout throughout all of our lives. But immigration tends to speed it up. In other words, you ask yourself, well, who am I really? It's like if you move from one country to the other, where you don't look like everybody else, you don't speak the language like everybody else, and especially you don't know the rules of that context, you're going to ask yourself very deep, soul-searching questions, and immigration tends to be one of those moments that opens the soul for the gospel. That's where people will look at all their background and say, what I really need is a greater hand involved in my life. And it just it's almost shocking to think this is one of our greatest opportunities for gospel expansion throughout the world as we receive immigrants. But yet is the Christian church the one that keeps on kind of, perennially be pushing and saying, yeah, we love Mexicans, we love taking mission trips to Mexico, but just make sure that they don't come and mow my lawn and, live next to me and that kind of stuff. And, we'll go and do all kinds. Hey, I got
The first applause on the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because I thought to myself when we were doing a panel, I said, first of all, who put the panel after Charlie Dates? That was the first thing I thought, because that was a mistake. And then, but you got it a little bit out. It's good. But I'm going to push on this a little bit. Okay, so we actually released research today at the Billy Graham Center Institute. It's on the front page of Christianity Today right now. Evangelicals are more anti-immigration, and more. We know that from multiple research projects. We know that evangelicals have substantially supported the current administration as well. We also know that an illegal immigrant, to use a term that people would use who are disparaging it, an illegal immigrant from Mexico is more likely to be an evangelical pastor than a rapist or a murderer. So, but with that all being said, how do you persuade your people, our people? That's our family. So what are we going to say to them, and how do we do it?
I think one thought that I've always had in my heart is that Jesus didn't give us an organization. He didn't say, hey, build big buildings and make sure to have screen TVs and, big screen TVs and, smokes, when people lead worship. He just gave us a table.
Yeah, let me just say, just so we're clear, we don't do that kind of stuff here. This is the orchestra pit. That's the choir. There's no smoke machine. Just gospel.
Amen.
Amen? All right. Sorry.
Hey, Jesus gave us a table, and in the table there's no high chairs and lower chairs.
Oh, I love that.
He's the one that opens the chair and invites us into a table, and he's the meal itself. And I know one thing that I love about communion. I know now we're Americans, really, so we can't take communion from the same cup because, because we're sanitized, individual plastic little cups. We're like, everything that's worse for us.
There you go.
Yeah, it's
Happy
individual, it's plastic.
That's right, give that back. Don't touch it.
And Jesus gave him one cup. Exactly the one thing that is so anti-American is like, everybody drinks from the same cup. And the problem is that we're going to get each other's germs.
Yeah.
And somebody tells me, I'm not a medical doctor, but people tell me that
He actually is. So that,
people tell me that when I kiss my wife, if I only kiss my wife, all her germs and my germs become one, and I'm less inclined to get sick because we kind of share the same everything.
yeah, we need to get to your point. It's getting a little gross. So go ahead and let's get back to there, because this is an important point.
I feel like the mess of the
I
family.
have 7 kids, by the way.
They have 7
yeah.
kids. That explains all that germ swapping. All right, go ahead.
I feel like the mess of the table
Yeah.
it belongs to everyone in the table, and I feel like that's a very clear word that Jesus didn't speak as much as he demonstrated. I feel like the table,
Yeah. It's a beautiful
inviting
picture.
people into saying this is our mess. Can I say one more thing?
You can, I'm going to go to Duke, but go ahead, right? You can say one more thing, and then I'll go to him.
Laquan McDonald. Just last week.
Not everyone's going to know who
2
that is, though, so give a little more context.
Oh well.
They're big in Chicago news, and maybe some national, but not everyone will know.
Young men just half a mile away from each other's congregations was shot 16 times, and
Young African-American male.
the African-American young man, and he was actually literally shot, 16 times. He was already lying down dead, and policemen kept on shooting, and recording came out, and the court case was settled just a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and I was watching it, and
Just so we're clear, it was found guilty. I mean, so
Yeah.
that's not settled in the sense of a
yeah, it
lawsuit.
was finished.
He was found guilty.
But
The
as
office- the
the
officer.
entire city watched this, I feel like especially the south side of our city watch on TV, televised what's going to be the verdict, what's going to happen. And I felt like afterwards, I was watching and I didn't even realize that I was not breathing. My wife actually told me, hey, breathe. And after the verdict came out, I started weeping, and I thought, this is what's going to happen. This is what could have happened to our city. And I was talking to a couple of friends afterwards, and one of our friends, he didn't even, in the city of Chicago, just a pastor. He doesn't live in the South Side. He didn't even know what was going on. And I'm thinking, wow, this was affecting all of us. I was like weeping at the verdict, and it didn't matter to you. And I'm like thinking, I feel like we share one cup, we share one bread. I think we've got to take the table of the Lord seriously.
Amen.
And that means it makes us one family.
Thank you. Amen. Amen. Duke, it's hard sometimes to go from a city to a city and different issues even here, but you've heard that. You maybe saw that on the national news as well. What would you add? I mean, how do we avoid this binary conversation? How does a person of Asian descent relate and speak into this?
Well, first, on the larger question of immigration, just to add this
Please.
Angle to it, one concern that I have is that the church, or even cities in general, out of a desire to extend compassion or hospitality to immigrants, to those that are new to this area, new to our churches, new to this culture, that we do not unwittingly patronize them as those who are appropriate objects of our service, our assets, our resources, our love. I think it's important as we approach new relationships with immigrant communities and immigrants that we understand that we need them.
That's so good.
That there are cultural riches that are formed and fashioned as part of God's radiance, His image, that need to be weaved into the life of the church, that are a blessing to the city in a positive sense, that even if there are communication barriers or knowledge barriers or otherwise, that we need to approach them with a gospel ethic of mutuality. And that'll save us from a lot of unintended harm that can often happen. This bigger question about the place of other types of minorities in the church's racial conversation as well as our countries, this is an important underexplored dimension to what you might call racial reconciliation or harmony. Generally, the dialogue tends to be black and white. And I would be quick to add, appropriately so. The black-white struggle is the archetypal ethnic racial struggle in this country.
This nation. Yeah.
And we need to dial things back and to plumb the depths of these wrongs and histories and repair these wounds in order that we might be able to heal together as a nation that has now become comprised of every nation of the world. And so what I like to say is it's actually, even as an Asian American, it's important to enter into that black-white conversation, because you cannot, in this nation's history, you cannot understand blackness without understanding whiteness.
That's good.
Blackness having been defined culturally and historically by white norms, institutions, and otherwise. You cannot understand blackness without understanding the history of whiteness, and therefore you can also not understand Asianness or brownness or Mexicanness without also having some insight into the black and white dynamic, understanding blackness and whiteness. And in that regard, in a very real sense, we're in this together. It's good for us to start there, but we cannot stay there in that binary. And some of that is because the sin and evil of racism has many, many faces. That's the sad reality of it. There's a complexity to the different experiences of racism. If we are to unroot the reality of racism in this country and in the American church, we need to view it from all angles. In other words, not just racism against the African American community, but also against the Latin American community and the Asian American community. We need to have conversations where we're able to speak into each other's experiences, reflect our own, and the other side of the ledger, to give new wisdom as to what racial righteousness can look like, what healing can look like, because we're all standing in different parts of the stage with different vantage points and perspectives, and we really do need each other. I don't know that we believe this, but we really do need each other.
And that's where I want to go, and I want to ask Mark, I want to ask you a question. Oh, yeah, for sure. Mark, I'd like you to answer without standing up this next question. Yeah, he's not the president yet. He's not the president yet. And actually, that's really what I'm asking you the question, because you're not yet the president. You're going to have all these new responsibilities. But you've been a pastor for a long time. You got a kind of unique background, and so it's not, I mean, you're Anglo. People see you as Anglo, but also your background in Spain and all that sort of stuff. But talk to me a minute about your church, because where a lot of people are right now is, because I mean, even this conversation has been a challenge. We actually focused more on racial division and socioeconomic challenge, and we got honest about Chicago and maybe some cities. But the U.S. has, and Milton is exactly right, Toronto's the most diverse city in the world. The U.S., though, has more ethnic diversity than any country in the world. It's not the most ethnically diverse. It's about number of people, ethno-linguistic people groups. Chicago, filled with it. You have sought to build bridges, and I mean, for those who don't know, Paco's one of the pastors at their church. So what have you done, what has it done because you've done it? I mean, because our panel's almost up. I want to make sure we kind of think about the state of where we are and where we go from here.
Yeah. So my wife is Mexican-American, so her grandparents were born in Mexico, but she's a typical third generation, doesn't speak Spanish. I do speak Spanish, she doesn't. We go to a Mexican restaurant, they talk to her in Spanish, and I answer, so it's confusing. Or my son, who was playing with the little Indian kid across the street when he was small, I said, where were you? He said, I was playing with the Mexicans. I said, they're not Mexicans, they're Indian. You're Mexican. He said, no, I don't think so, Dad. I said, yeah, believe me, you're Mexican, they're Indian. Here's the thing.
I love Mark Jobe. Don't you just love Mark Jobe? Anyway.
Here's the thing. If I'm a church planter, I'm thinking about the 25-year-old guy that's planting a church, maybe in Chicago, maybe in another city, and you're thinking, wow, they're talking about systemic justice and change. I'm just trying to survive. I'm just trying to gather a core of 25 and preach the gospel. So let me just address that. I have people all over the country that come, and I pastor a majority non-white church. Probably 70% is ethnic, 30% is white. But I've never intentionally tried to make it a diverse congregation. What drives me, I believe in diversity and the beauty of diversity, but my goal is not to make it diverse. My goal is I'm driven by the love of the gospel of Jesus Christ to preach the gospel to whoever is around me as much as I can by whatever means I can, and not ignoring any ethnicity that lives around us. I don't expect your church to be diverse. You're in a black neighborhood. Why would it be Mexican or Asian? And I don't think you should feel bad about it. I don't think that Paco should feel bad that he doesn't have a bunch of African Americans in his church or Asian in his church. He's in a Mexican community. I think that what should drive us is the love that Jesus had for all people. And if our community is diverse and there's bigotry and bias in our soul, that's a problem. What drives me is not necessarily ratios of how do I make this a diverse congregation. What drives me is that there are thousands of people around my church that do not know the love of Jesus Christ or the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I want to present it as clearly, as powerfully as I can, and not ignore anybody that lives in my community. That has led us, yeah, thank you. That has led us, though, to ask our question, how do we reach cities? And for us, we realized that we needed to be aggressive at church planting. And so we're a multi-site church, but we're an anomaly multi-site church, because most multi-site churches that start in the country are in middle-class white suburbs, a mega pastor that videos out to another place. I don't have any problem with that. However the gospel can go there, I'm good with that. A lot of my friends do that. I felt like we didn't want to go to neighborhoods and project a white face into a Mexican neighborhood or a white preacher into a black community. I wanted the faces of the preachers to match the people in the community. So we decided that there's a power to doing this together, but what if there was a church planting movement in the city that reached the black, the white, the Hispanic, the rich, the poor? What if we did it that way? So Paco's in a little village. Man, you go to his worship service, and it's like a piece of little Mexico. I mean, the worship is that way too. We don't try to do it the same way. They're waving flags all over, super hyped up. You know, everybody comes late. I saw him come late to this gathering, by the way, about 20 minutes late.
That's true.
Yeah. I saw you, Paco. This is event-oriented.
It is event.
You show up on time, and you think no one's coming to church. No, they'll come. They'll stay way late, but they're going to come. And but you know, that dynamic is very different than our Lincoln Park location, where everybody shows up on time. They're mainly white, college educated, and they're afraid of too much. You know, they respond to humor and insight, but they don't wave flags. And I believe the gospel is for I believe the gospel can contextualize itself throughout the neighborhoods. The cities are a cluster of hundreds of tribes. And I think the church needs to be aware that there are tribes in the city, and the gospel needs to be contextualized to the tribes. Not exclusive, but joined together to reach all the tribes of the city.
Would you join me in thanking the panel? Let me lead us in a word of prayer while Jessica comes. Father, we thank you for churches and pastors and scholars that can help us, provoke us to love and good deeds, so we might think more deeply on the mission to which you have sent us, to the cities to where you've sent us. So, Father, may your name and your fame be more widely known among people of every tongue, tribe, and nation, so that you might receive your due glory in the church and in all the world. In Jesus' name. Amen.